Welcome to the Canadian Philosophy Show. My name is Nicole Kirigin, and I'm here with Michael Robert Caditz and Hale Rothery. Thank you so much. I'm Nicole. I'm from Simon Fraser University. I'm an undergraduate student studying philosophy and psychology. And I guess Hale, you can introduce yourself next.
Hi, I'm Hale Rothery, as Nicole introduced me. I'm a philosophy student at Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo.
And Michael, go ahead.
I'm Michael Robert Caditz. I was a philosophy student at Vancouver Island University, and now I'm doing something different.
Yeah, thank you for listening to us. So our topic today is how can we live a good life in the face of COVID-19? And this topic is going forward with the assumption that the pandemic and its new ways of life will persist in the long term, at least to some extent. And I will be giving some perspectives, philosophical perspectives from Aristotle and ancient Greek philosophy on how we can live a good life. And we will later apply Aristotle's teachings onto our current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. So starting off, what is a good life? The term eudaimonia is used in ancient Greek philosophy to conceptualize what a good life is. Eu means good or happy, and daimon means soul. Together, the term is roughly translated to good soul, and modern day it's conceptualized as happiness. So the term eudaimonia is used by Aristotle as a term to describe the highest human good. You become a eudaimon when you actualize your true human potential and flourish. If you are striving to express the best within yourself and you come to that point, you are a eudaimon and you're living a eudaimonia, a good life. So how do we experience eudaimonia? How do we actually actualize our human potential and flourish? Aristotle believes that's through virtuous activity of the soul. So a central aim of Aristotle's philosophy is to discuss how we can achieve eudaimonia, the highest human good. And this term eudaimonia is a central term, as well as the term arete, meaning virtue or excellence, and phronesis, meaning practical or ethical wisdom. And Nicomachean and Ethics, Aristotle establishes that eudaimonia is agreed upon as the highest good for human beings. However, there is significant disagreement on how to actually achieve a good life, according to many philosophers at that time, and even now. So Aristotle says that some people believe that the pursuit of pleasure, wealth, or honor is how to achieve a good life, but others that will also say that a good life is one in which you are happy. And Aristotle believes that a good life in which you are happy is like the way you achieve a good life. And that statement in itself doesn't seem to really say very much. And you could also argue that the pursuit of pleasure, wealth, or honor can make you happy. So that is something that can be argued against in Aristotle's philosophy. But in general here, Aristotle believes that eudaimonia, or the pursuit of a good life, is best pursued by living a virtuous life. And then how do we live a virtuous life? We can't just merely be born with eudaimonia and a virtuous life. Eudaimonia consists in activities that exercise the rational part of the psyche in accordance with the virtues of excellency or reason. So it requires activity and it requires rational thought. You can't just have an innate ability for a virtuous life, according to Aristotle. And another important aspect of Aristotle's philosophy here is the doctrine of the mean. So I'm going to use the virtue of courage here. And Aristotle believes that in order to be virtuous, you have to actualize these virtues within a mean. So there's a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess. Virtue is in the mean of those two things. So cowardice is the vice of deficiency for courage, and then virtue is the middle, and then the excess is recklessness. So, and Aristotle believes that we all have tendencies to fall towards either a deficiency or an excess of each virtue. And the way that we live a good life is to try to find out where we lie in these and then try to hone a virtuous life by going more towards the mean and not being excessive and not being deficient in any of these virtues. And I'm going to apply this to the COVID-19 pandemic by saying that we are lacking several things in our society due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are lacking social contact and connection, economic stability, personal safety, autonomy, progress and accomplishment, and certainty and predictability. And these things that I've listed have a lot of overlap with what Aristotle believes is like a virtuous and how you live a good life. And I really want to discuss here, in light of all the restrictions that we have and the barriers that we have, how can we truly establish and actualize a good life in ourselves? And I want to bring this conversation to my co-hosts now, and I want to say that I want to ask either Hale or Michael first, what do you feel that you're currently lacking with the COVID-19 pandemic compared to your life before?
I think like before we dive too much into like the philosophical side of things, what like jumps out for me initially is the lack of, I would say, varied and spontaneous human interaction. Like, I'll preface and say that I really, ironically, since we're on, Zoom or what is this, Discord? Here, I'm showing it right there. I am very technologically challenged. And for me, interacting with people in a face-to-face personal way, and especially spontaneously, is really important, and I found for me really energizes my life, and particularly my thinking as well. And really being lacked in on that and being boxed into like having a particular set social circle that kind of, we're being asked, at least in our part of the world, to have a certain set number of people that you can see and keep it to that close circle is definitely been, I find, a drain might be the right way to put it, a drain on me for sure.
Thank you for sharing, Hale. Michael, share what you feel you're lacking right now.
One thing is safety. So I have a need, as I think many people do, for safety and security. But I'm having trouble getting my need for safety met because if I go out of my apartment, walk down the street, go into an elevator, go into a restaurant, if I participate in many of the activities, most of the activities that I, before the COVID, participated in, I don't feel safe because of the risk of getting sick. So safety is hard to come by. Meeting my need for safety entails a very constrained life where I'm isolated from people and I cannot do many of the activities. I can't, I'm putting off dental work, I'm putting off some, medical issues that I want to tend to, but they aren't urgent. So the need for safety is causing the walls to close in very close.
Thank you for sharing. So I'm going to also ask some follow-up questions here. So I'm going to say, Michael, how does your need for safety and either your access to or lack of safety play a role into your development of your character? Because according to Aristotle, everything that we do to live a good life and to live a happy life depends on what those activities do to build our character and our virtue.
Yeah, well, without
that in there.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with Aristotle's view, but I would say that I'm developing and honing and exercising a new skill, a new character building skill, which is how to adapt to a situation like this, the external constraint of a worldwide pandemic, how to adapt to that and how to do the best I can. I don't agree with Aristotle's view, as we're representing it to be, that happiness is primarily about character building, because I would argue that happiness is also about getting other types of needs met. But I would agree that I definitely am building some character.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it from more of a positive light. Hale, in terms of what you shared previously, how could you relate that with Aristotle's view on building your personal character and virtue? And how would the COVID-19 pandemic put a barrier in that goal as outlined by Aristotle?
When I think about my experiences lately and thinking about certain character aspects, one might be determination and focus versus, and on the other side of it, you might be able to put something like we might have a mean, as we would say, of like of proper focus, and one side of obsession and another side of sort of, what's the word I'm looking at? I wanted to say floating around from thing to thing, a kind of ADHD type of mindset. I'm finding for myself, especially spending so much time at home, it's been very challenging for me to find that Aristotelian mean that's so like essential within his system. And again, we can get into discussions about whether or not how I feel about that as well. But find it, at least my personal subjective experience has been, it's very challenging for me to find that mean. And I think like a lot of people, I've found hobbies and interests that I can do from home, and I get way too obsessed and way too into them at the detriment of like other parts of my character or responsibilities or whatever. Or I find myself in my days at home just bouncing around from thing to thing and not really actually getting anything done and not being particularly successful with stuff. Obviously, that's the two are extremes that like isn't all the time for either. But I do find myself, it's a lot of times struggling and oscillating between those two sort of cognitive positions. So
Yeah. So you bring up balance. Sure. Really, like balance is something that, as a general term, I would say that I lack, especially now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's interesting, Hale, that you use and you talk of balance as a more general thing, because Aristotle usually brings up balance in terms of like a specific virtue, finding the mean for for courage. But really, balance has a greater applicability to everything in our lives. If we are if I'm going to be obsessing over a book for a week, what cost does that come to like other things in my life, and how does that actually build my character in terms of, even if you think about it with like lacking, if I'm reading this book and I don't eat well, or I don't exercise, or I don't talk to my friends in this period, there is definitely a cost to that. And there's definitely more to building your character than just 12 virtues that are listed. It is more widely encompassing than that. So here, I'm actually reiterating some of the talking points that we discussed in the vaccine passport show that we did previously. And I'm going to bring up the points and I want us to discuss on how they relate to Aristotle's ethics and Aristotle's view on a good life. So one thing that I think that we are lacking, and Hale, you brought this up, is social contact and connection. So the ability to see your family, your friends, meet new people, dating, all those things, it's all impacted by the pandemic. So in terms of Aristotle's, I guess let's say his golden mean, how we could say that we are being impacted in this regard, because if we are isolating ourselves, we are not building, we are like having a deficiency of that virtue of social contact, that virtue of connection, if you conceptualize it that way. And there's also economic stability, which we brought up. So job security, poverty, personal safety, protection against COVID-19, access to healthcare, autonomy, the ability to make your own choices, progress and accomplishment, time feels slowed, and also certainty and predictability. What is coming next? The point that I really think that really closely aligns with Aristotle here is the point of progress and accomplishment. So, and I think that really closely aligns with Aristotle here, because Aristotle talks about the building of your character as a predominant thing that we should be focusing on. And if we are feeling static and we are not spending a lot of time thinking of the future, thinking and thinking about how to improve ourselves, where do those virtues come in here? So I'm going to share that I feel that I have stagnated a little bit, actually quite a bit, with the COVID-19 pandemic. I feel that I have not done as much as I could do, and in a way, we live in a culture that values efficiency and productivity and getting things done, and you don't necessarily have to fall into that culture if you don't necessarily need to. You don't need to be constantly making money for the sake of making money. You can make money to live comfortably, for example. But I still do feel an intrinsic value myself in pushing myself to be as good as I can, and learning things and meeting new people, and doing things that go outside my comfort zone. Those are all things that I feel help me build my character, and I don't feel that that has been necessarily met with the within the limits of the pandemic. But I know that Aristotle would not think of that as a good excuse. He would say, what can you do with these restrictions to build your character in that regard? So I wonder, Hale or Michael, do you have any comments on this? Do you feel like you have been working towards progress and accomplishment recently? And what have you been doing to get around that realization?
I think I'll go first. I'm trying to think about how to say this and formulate this for our audience, and so bear with me. I think that there's a struggle, especially with the virtue ethics, where the emphasis on building one's self character sometimes misses the point of perhaps ethical integration and socialization on like a more communal and social level. And Mikey, I hope you don't mind, but I think back to Mikey's primary concern, and those persons in this pandemic, who are many, who are under like considerable threat from what's going on, and those persons who are also many, who have unfortunately either passed away or have become significantly harmed by the pandemic. I mean, literally from the disease. And on the one hand, where I find myself thinking about how like the constraints that pandemic puts on me on a sort of virtue ethics type level would be sort of constraining my ability to self-actualize and all this kind of stuff. I also sometimes wonder to what degree are those things actually primary versus the sacrifices that each individual needs to make within the context of a wider social, wider social duties. That's I hope what I'm getting at is coming across a little bit. Mike, I don't know if you have anything to kind of add there or like to pull out of what I'm saying, but
I think we're touching on a fundamental issue, which is the tension between the idea that happiness is not contingent upon external factors versus the idea that our happiness depends on external factors. So one might argue that Aristotle lands in the former camp in that he seems to argue that happiness is not, the true happiness or eudaimonia is not a function of material wealth or external factors, but rather it's internal building of character and living up to one's potential and integrity, living by the golden mean. So Aristotle seems to argue that it's more of an internal development issue that happiness is. And similarly, I think the existentialists argue that external constraints are never an excuse, or they're never a reason to flee our freedom as humans and to live inauthentically. In other words, even if you're in jail, even if you're drafted into the army, according to Sartre, you still have the responsibility and the opportunity to live authentically and flourish as a free human. On the other hand, I'm going to cite utilitarian ethics, where it seems that the way that people behave toward other people determines what the greatest amount of happiness will be for the greatest amount of people. So those would be external factors. So according to utilitarian ethics or consequentialist ethics, the policy making decisions of governments and the way that people behave to each other is determinative of the amount of happiness that people will have. So if that's true, then happiness seems to come from the outside. So the way that you behave, Nicole, or the way that you behave toward me, Hale, or the way that the policies of the government, whatever they are, seems to determine how much happiness I and other people will have. So it comes from the external. So I think it's an interesting debate, and I think there's some truth to both, and I think I land probably somewhere in the middle. I land at the golden mean, which is I think that happiness does in part depend on external circumstances. I don't think it's plausible to argue that someone who has a lot of money and a lot of wealth and who lives a life of luxury and has a beautiful mansion that they live in and has everything they want at their fingertips, and they have all the food that they want and all the time for recreation they want, and that person does not have a greater opportunity for happiness than someone who is very, very poor and disadvantaged and living in a slum. Look at the people in India now who are suffering and dying in the streets, dying because there's not oxygen left in the oxygen tanks, and their bodies are being burned in parking lots. How can you argue that the latter case, those people can be just as happy as a billionaire living in a mansion? I don't think that's plausible to hold that position. So I think external circumstances do matter, but at the same time, we know that there are people who have a lot of money and a lot of power that are corrupt and probably not very happy. So
I think actually Aristotle talks exactly about this when he says, and it's been a little while since I personally read the Ethics, but I do know there's elements where he talks about the structure of your internal character and your ability to utilize what he would call practical wisdom, of which the Greek word escapes me right now, is primary, but also context matters, and he talks exactly about that, right? That like if you're in a terrible, terrible, terrible circumstances, even if you've got pretty good practical wisdom, you're probably not going to be a particularly flourishing person, right? Because you just don't have the things around you to utilize and engage with, and perhaps your body doesn't work, you can barely move, whatever it may be, you're sick, whatever it might be. And so it becomes extremely difficult and frankly unrealistic to expect someone in those sorts of situations, like the ones you were pointing out, Mikey, to actually achieve those things. On the other hand, now, I think sometimes, especially when we're talking about Aristotle, we can get a little confused, or I guess I'll say I can struggle with the term happiness, because I think there's some linguistic implications there, that maybe I don't necessarily think Aristotle necessarily meant himself, but wherein, like, do I necessarily, given the circumstances and the world around me, and particularly my rights and duties to other people, is the achievement of happiness for me actually primary? Is that really the primary thing for me living what would be considered a good or moral or ethical life? And I would say there are times when the answer is no. There are times when duties, particularly to others, to my society, to my community, put me in situations which I would rather not be in. But the question is not whether I would rather not be in them or whether or not they're pleasurable or even flourishing. The question is whether or not I'm supposed to be there.
Yeah, thank you, Hale. I think that an interesting point that was brought up here by Michael was from Sartre, in which Sartre would say that you are fleeing your freedom if you like, let's say you're a prisoner and you say, oh, I'm a prisoner, I can't do anything now, I can't be free, there's nothing I can do now. Like, if you succumb to that, you are fleeing your freedom. You can always do something. You can always say, like, I believe that he said, you can always say no, right? And that's an expression of your freedom. There's always something you can do to manifest your authenticity, your freedom, and those things, right? Looking at the barriers and restrictions that we have now, like, for example, balancing your pursuit of progress and accomplishment and personal identity with public health goals, and not trying to overstep those public health goals in order for your own goals. That how can we work within our limitations to flourish as a human being? And of course, what about, like, parts of it in terms of what you actually need to flourish, I believe, are very individualistic. There's certain things that are brought up by different philosophers, and I'll actually bring up a perspective from positive psychology. So positive psychology generally lists 6 dimensions of eudaimonia, a good life, which is number 1, self-discovery; number 2, perceived development of one's best potentials; number 3, a sense of purpose and meaning in life; number 4, investment of significant effort in pursuit of excellence; number 5, intense involvement in activities; and number 6, enjoyment of activities as personally expressive. So given that this is an accurate list of what we need in order to live a good life and in order to go towards this goal of progress and accomplishment and self-development in this regard, if let's say that we have, you say, oh, I can't socialize because I don't like Zoom and I don't want to talk to people over Zoom, and therefore I'm not going to socialize. Okay, given that socialization is an important good that we have to go towards in order to reach our full of human development, you can't just say, okay, I'm not going to socialize, and still go towards what you need to, or go towards living like a good life in that way. What you can do within that restriction is you can say, okay, what are the things that I can do in order to socialize and build my social skills, for example? What you can do here is if you can't see somebody, I'm not giving like advice here, but if, let's say, you can't meet people indoors, don't do that. Like, instead, go and talk to somebody, like at a picnic table or something like that. Like, there's always going to be something that you can do to manifest like your strengths here. And I can't say specifically what somebody would need to do, but there's according to Aristotle and other philosophers in positive psychology, there's always going to be something that you can do to manifest a good life and your personal development here.
Well, Sartre talked about there being no external moral code or set of directives by which humans live, that morality comes from within, that humans as completely free creatures make their own choices, either authentic or not authentic choices. But Sartre didn't argue for complete chaos or anarchy. He talked about, for example, the burden that humans have when they realize that the decisions they make are decisions for all humanity. So it transfers the burden onto individuals. So I'm going to relate that to the pandemic. So as a free person, I can choose to what my level of risk is going to be, whether I want to wear masks or whether I want to go to restaurants, whether I want to go to gatherings and hang out with my friends, how close I want to stand to people. As a free human being, I can make those choices. Now, there may be restrictions imposed on me by the government in various jurisdictions, but even then, I'm still free to choose. I could take the risk of getting fined or getting thrown in jail or whatever. So, I'm a free human being, but the clincher is here, the catch is that as a free human being, this is sort of a libertarian idea. The choices that I make become choices for all humanity. Therefore, if I choose to take risks, actually this is one could argue this is counter-libertarian, because it's actually entails an understanding that there are consequences to other people for my actions, whereas sometimes libertarians, they pretend like they have this huge space they can operate within the huge autonomous space. But if I realize that if I choose to disregard the safety protocols, if I choose to disregard the physical distancing recommendations, if I choose not to get vaccinated, then I am making a choice for all society, for all human beings. And I am putting other people at risk. I'm putting public health at risk. So I have the freedom to do what I want, but if I'm going to be an authentic human being and exercise my freedom authentically, and this might be totally consistent with Aristotle, right? If I'm going to build my character, then I need to understand that my actions have consequences for other people also. So I think, again, the Aristotelian view and the existentialist view have some things in common here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I actually want to say here that that statement that by making a personal choice, you are also making a choice for all of society, whether you want that or not. That's also something from a Kantian perspective, in terms of, like, you can characterize that as a universal law. So the things that you do are the things that will be like put onto the rest of society. So Kant would argue that if you choose to lie, you are now saying that, oh, it's okay to lie, and the rest of society can lie. It's kind of goes on to that, and you can make an argument that in terms of like the public health consequences of not getting vaccinated, and this is a big argument that is used in favor of everybody getting vaccinated, which is, if you choose not to get vaccinated, you are putting other people at harm's way. So it's not just an individual decision, or from a more, I guess, libertarian perspective. If you choose not to get vaccinated, you do make that if you make that choice, you are putting other people at risk, even if you like it or not. And there's other examples to this as well, not just with the pandemic, but I think it's a good timely example.
Right. I love that you brought Kant into this, because I would argue similarly to you, Nicole, that from a Kantian perspective, we could make a very good argument that the moral thing to do is to get vaccinated. And the reason is because one of the formulations of Kant's categorical imperative suggests that an action is moral. An action has moral worth if it's universalizable. In other words, if you could make a statement that everybody should do X, and that would lead to a good outcome, that would lead to a better outcome for society, that would lead to a sustainable outcome, then that is in fact the moral thing to do, which is why lying is immoral according to Kant. Because if you were to universalize that and say everybody should lie, then you're going to not have a very great society, right? That's not going to be a sustainable world if you can't trust what people say, because everyone's always lying. But you can universalize everyone should tell the truth. You should tell the truth, because then you have a viable, workable, sustainable society with sustainable relationships. So now let's universalize no one should get a vaccine. So what does that lead to? It leads to massive sickness and death, right? It leads to an ongoing pandemic, which will only end when millions and millions and millions of people die, and many people are sick, and hospitals overloaded, and great amounts of suffering. But what if you universalize everybody should get a vaccine? Well, that's similar to everybody should tell the truth. What you wind up with is a probable diminishment, if not elimination, of the pandemic, of the virus, and a quickest possible return to normalcy.
Thank you, Michael. And again, we're essentially the half point here. You're listening to the Canadian Philosophy Show, and this is for people who tuned in a little bit later. So yeah, and Michael, I really appreciated your discussion here on the universal law and the categorical imperative from Kant. One thing that I want to actually ask you to discuss here, and because you actually brought up NVC, nonviolent communication, as somewhat of an addition or even rejection or semi-rejection of Aristotle's virtue ethics here, because Aristotle claims that a good life is one where you pursue the golden mean of these virtues. So you don't go with an excess of a virtue or a deficiency of a virtue. So courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. And in order to live a good life and a happy life, you build your character by going towards the golden mean of these different virtues. So Michael, how does nonviolent communication, or NVC, kind of add to this perspective?
I wouldn't say that the NVC perspective refutes Aristotle at all. I think it's a different way of looking at happiness. It's a different window, slightly different frame. So, whereas Aristotle talks about happiness as being attribute of character rather than external circumstances, and NVC talks about happiness as being tied to getting needs met. So according to the nonviolent communication philosophy, which was developed by Marshall Rosenberg, all human beings are pursuing getting their needs met, and the level of happiness that people have is in relationship to how well their needs are being met. So it's a different way of measuring or viewing or defining happiness. And the situation where there's external circumstances that are very constraining, like this pandemic, It just makes it more difficult for people to meet their needs. Not impossible, but it makes it much more difficult. And so it follows that happiness is harder to come by. So I think the NVC approach is more inclusive of external factors than either existentialism or perhaps Aristotle, where an MVC recognizes that oftentimes needs require external factors, such as needs for connection require other people to connect with. Needs for safety require that your environment is safe, which it hardly is during the pandemic. Needs for health and shelter and things like that become more difficult when there's a pandemic. And so I kind of like the MVC approach, which I think it's more balanced. Paradoxically, it's more a golden mean type of view, because it understands that the MVC approach recognizes that happiness is both external and internal.
My question here would be, is how compatible is NVC with Aristotle's philosophy of virtue ethics here? And because Michael, you said that they're not at odds with each other, they don't compete with each other. So if somebody wanted to apply both to their lives, how could they combine NVC and virtue ethics?
Aristotle, in his golden mean formulation, emphasizes rational thought, that humans, in fact, what makes a human unique, what makes a human is the human being's capability for rationality. And so a human employs his or her rationality to achieve that golden mean, to weigh both sides, to weigh all sides of a situation and not go to extremes, but rather to be a rational person and to make rational choices. And likewise, NVC talks about developing rational strategies to meet one's needs. So, especially in difficult times like a pandemic, it requires rationality to say, okay, what is my best possible strategy to meet my needs for connection with other people as best as I can? But at the same time, not endangering my health, not endangering or risking the meeting of other needs, right? If I get sick, then my need for health isn't being met. So NVC demands the use of our rational minds to come up with strategies that are most likely to meet a maximum number of needs. So maybe that strategy would be simply going online and doing Zoom calls and joining groups and connecting with people online as the best we can do during the time of pandemic. So I think NVC in many ways is similar to Aristotelian views, and it entails use of rationality to find approaches that are likely to succeed.
Yeah, it sounds like it seeks for us to use our practical wisdom to find virtue in the circumstances that we're set with, which makes perfect sense to me, for what it's worth.
Right. So if you're driven by your passion or by your emotions, and as many people are these days, we see them around us, who just say, I'm tired of the pandemic, I'm done with it, I don't care, I'm going to go resume my normal life. I'm not going to wear a mask anymore, I'm sick of it. I think both from an NVC viewpoint and from an Aristotelian viewpoint, that would be extreme and not likely to be successful in meeting our needs or the needs of our community.
And that's something that you bring up there. I think, especially when I think about the needs of the community. I mean, look, I firmly believe, at least from my own life, and then for most of the people that I know, so relatively anecdotally, I'm certainly not going to speak for anything wider than that. There is a lot of freedom of movement and ability and options, even given this pandemic, for us to meet our needs and try and figure things out as best we can. The one thing, though, that comes up for me that I keep thinking about is, especially with virtue ethics, is the the focus, the goal is always the internal betterment of the person, and not necessarily the betterment or what's best for like the community or the duties to others. And there's ways that can be like worked in, but that's not the main focus of virtue ethics. And I do, at least where my mind goes, is there are circumstances in which things might get so bad that the context realistically doesn't allow for people to express themselves in ways where they really can find succinct and successful ways to be like quote unquote happy. But that doesn't get, if there are other factors at play that are particularly other regarding, individuals might still have duties that supersede those sorts of more personal needs, i.e. happiness.
Yeah. My question here is like, are there ever situations where your personal needs, for example, your personal need for self-actualization, can override somebody else's need? And I guess it can depend on the severity of like what you're overriding. So one thing is that one way of conceptualizing this is everybody has a negative right not to be harmed, right? That's kind of one way that it's, I think, a term that's used in political philosophy. But not everybody has a positive right to ask somebody else to do something for them. So like negative rights are usually viewed as stronger than positive rights here. So I guess you could use that framework to say that my positive right to ask other people to help me with my personal development does not override somebody else's negative right for me not to harm them.
And where my mind goes, and taking it back to Kant a little bit with this sort of question, is that like we can think about harm in terms of also what's the word look for, like using people, right? That
as a means to an end.
Yeah, exactly. If we're using people, sorry, the word I'm looking for is a means, right? Like if we're purely treating someone as a means for my own self-actualization, then that I look, I want to take the position that there are times when that is not there. There's never times when that's morally justifiable to use someone purely as a means for my own self-actualization. Do I think people, if we're talking outside of like ethics, do I think people do it all the time? Yeah, all the time. Right? Do I think that there's ever moral grounds? I want to say no.
Yeah. I would be inclined to say that if we live in a society where we treat everybody else as an end in themselves and not a means to an end, which is the kind of the terminology that's used in is Kantian ethics and deontology here. If we are treating people as ends in themselves and not means, I would be inclined to say that we would lead to having be more virtuous ourselves and live in a more virtuous society.
Yeah, and
I would say that.
I do want to say too that like we started a conversation in terms of, and this kind of leads into community and other regarding ethical issues instead of like, which is really most of ethics, but instead of just talking about self-actualization in terms of virtue ethics. But virtue ethics actually like does play into this quite a bit, because Aristotle talks a lot about friendship, right? And he talks about 3 forms of friendship, and the first 2 aren't actually friendship. There's friendships of utility, which is basically using people. We have associations for using people. Use examples of businesses. The only reason, let's say, that I go to you, Nicole, is because you're someone who sells fish and I want fish, right? So I'm going to use you for that, right? Then there's friendships of pleasure, associations that we have for pleasurable activities or whatever those are. But then Aristotle talks about like the real connections, actual friendships, real friendship is being with someone or appreciating someone simply because they are the person that they are, right? And just and having no other significant motivations relating to that sort of reciprocal appreciation.
It's very compatible with Kantian.
Well, yeah, I think in a way,
like the end in themselves. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's that. I think that there's a lot of cross reference there for sure. So if you're actually, again, in Aristotle's way, if you're going to be like a person of character, then perhaps there is and perhaps we could expand that to say, if you're going to be a friend to society, not just if we're going to have friends individually, but if you're going to be a friends to your community, if you're going to be a proper like political like friend or whatever you want to call it, then that involves a deeper level of reciprocal respect and appreciation for every member of your community as a whole. And that implicitly involves the ways in which you treat people in given and all sorts of given contexts. And this particular context is the pandemic.
Okay. Michael, you can share.
Yeah, I think if we view happiness as a pursuit of needs, and a higher level of happiness is reflective of a higher success in meeting our individual needs, then that actually entails meeting the needs of other people. It entails cooperation, because unless you have the extreme anti-Aristotelian view that we are all atomic or atomized creatures who live in our individual vacuums and are not interdependent, which is an extreme view and really implausible. How many people here could survive without other people? I mean, I don't grow all my own food. I didn't make my shelter. I've received antibiotics a few times in my life that I don't know what would have happened to me if I didn't receive them. I think we're all interdependent, and so to the extent that I can help meet other people's needs, then I'm more likely to get my needs met, because those people are going to be more amenable to helping me. It's sort of a mutual cooperation pact, right? So I just wanted to clarify that I believe that that happiness does entail community and cooperation and caring about others, and I don't think Aristotle would disagree with that. I also wanted to say that we have a comment here. I'll read it. It's an interesting comment because it suggests an approach which we haven't talked about, which is sort of a deferred gratification approach. So we can talk about how the constrained times of pandemic actually afford an opportunity for us to turn inward. So the comment here is that I think that to be accomplished is to, in this time, when we're forced to sit with ourselves, it's to start to pursue our interests and understand our stories, so that when we're able, we can share that better with others. So I think what the writer is saying here is that one strategy we can use to find meaning and purpose and build character and move forward in an Aristotelian sense in the pandemic is to use this time to reflect on ourselves and to organize our own thoughts and make a plan for the future, with the idea that there will be an end to the pandemic at some point, whether it's in a few months or a few years. We'll be able to resume our full connections with others, and we'll have a better, more clear understanding of our goals.
I like that, and I appreciate the comment from whoever that listener was.
I would add on to that comment, and I would say that I don't think that there's a good way to work towards self-fulfillment, self-actualization without first understanding yourself. Of course, there might be some things you can do accidentally and by luck coming across. For example, if a part of your self-actualization is to build, your physical body as much as you can and your physical health. If you've done sports as a kid, through like your parents making you do sports, that's one way you can come across that piece of virtue accidentally. But I think to truly actualize yourself, as a virtuous person, as a fulfilled person, and as somebody who is flourishing, you have to have a sense of understanding of who you are and what you need as an individual, right? And that's actually where something like NVC, nonviolent communication, comes in there, because it really makes you think about what your needs are as a human being, and also how you individually influence what your needs are, because not everybody will have the same extent to the same needs that they need. Some people might have a higher need for the feeling of accomplishment, or some people might have a greater need for wanting to socialize with somebody else. Even though we may all have the same needs to some extent, people will have different extents to which they need to fulfill that need. So taking the time to really self-reflect, I think, is a really significant and honestly pretty much the first step you need to in order to self-actualize there. So I really appreciate that comment. So we're coming to the end of our show today. So I'm going to turn this around to Hale and Michael. Are there what are some last things that you want to share on this topic?
All I have to say is kind of coming from what I was thinking about. Perhaps one of the best ways, or one of the I will say one of the most important ways of building our character in this time is learning how to really be virtuous friends, not just to the people that we actually know, but to the people that we don't know, to our community large, and what sort of duties and stuff are implicit there, even if it's at least on a very sort of base level, involves us going through some challenges and some real difficulties.
And
that's all I got for now.
Aristotle's philosophy too, because he really talks about the importance of friendship and building virtue and self-actualization and a good life. Michael.
Yeah, I want to finish by supporting Aristotle here in that being aware of the golden mean, being aware of moderation, which I understand to be thoughtfulness, rationality, not reflexively giving in to impulses. I think that by being aware of that golden mean and exercising my ability to make rational decisions even when they may not be what I desire in that moment, that builds character. That, I believe, brings me closer to eudaimonia. It brings me closer to a deeper kind of happiness. Knowing that I have the strength to resist temptation. That doesn't mean always resist temptation. It means resist it when it would not be beneficial. There's times when temptation's fine, right? When there's no harm to be done to anybody. Go with the flow and, give in to, I want to, have that piece of cake in front of me because I'm tempted. No harm. Have the piece of cake, right? Or whatever it might be. But I want to bring this home to the pandemic. That's sort of where we started, which is that this is not a time to give in to temptation. The temptation to pretend that the virus doesn't exist, pretend that I'm done with it, to hell with the facts on the ground, I'm just going to pretend there is no more virus. Harm is going to come to me and or other people because of that. This is the time. Aristotle offers us a time to be moderate, to not give in to temptation, to use our human rationality, and to build our character, and to stick it out a little longer and make the right decisions.
Thank you, Michael. This is the Canadian Philosophy Show. My name is Nicole Kirigin. I'm here with Hale Rothery and Michael Robert Caditz. Thank you for listening.